Well, hello and welcome. My name is Kyle Portman. I'm here with Dr. Dirk Meyer from Iowa State University, and we were actually talking silo bags or grain bags. Um, and Dr. Meyer, um, you tell us, a little bit of background about silo bags and why we're talking about them today.
Well, thanks, Kyle. Well, silo or grain bag. Silo bag is a term that's used internationally, and grain bag is the term that we use more here in the United States. It's basically a alternative temporary storage technology that was at one time originally developed, for silage and haylage type of applications, but over the last 20 years has been utilized for actually storing grains, whether that's corn or soybeans or wheat or barley, sorghum, or a number of other grains. And the reason we're talking about that today, in particular this season here in preparation for the 2020 harvest, is because we had a number of grain bins, particularly on farms, but also at commercial facilities here throughout the state of Iowa, destroyed just a few weeks before the harvest will start. And we need to be considering some alternative systems in which we can store some of our grain. At a commercial elevator, they typically have so-called temporary outdoor piles that they can utilize for overflow, or they can relatively easily add to capture grain beyond the capacity of the fixed storage capacity, or to replace even capacity that has been damaged. On the farm, that's not as easily done, although a machinery shed can be converted under the right circumstances, and of course a farmer can also put a temporary pile out. But silo bags or grain bags provide really a better alternative in terms of maintaining quality of the grain under the current circumstances.
That makes complete sense with what the weather and also the devastation we saw with the derecho. Sometimes when I think about a grain bag, I think of something very small, like the hermetic bag that we see in Africa. But these aren't that size, right? Can you explain them a little bit to us? And
Yeah.
we have a picture here on the screen, but just explain a little bit about them.
Yeah, so again, here the silo bag system, as it is referred to here, was actually developed in the early 2000s in Argentina. And there's a particular reason why that was done, because the financial situation didn't allow Argentine farmers to build permanent infrastructure on their farms with regard to grain handling, drying, and storage. And so they developed and began to utilize these what they call silo bags and what we know as grain bags for temporary grain storage as an alternative low-cost on-farm technology. And today in Argentina, not only on farms but also at commercial facilities, about half of the entire Argentine crop, corn and soybeans, is stored in these silo bags. So it's a proven technology that we know much about as to how it can be utilized. And Argentina has successfully exported the technology in many, many different countries, more than 50 that where the technology is utilized, including in North America, both the US and Canada.
And what are some kind of advantages or of the bag themselves for the situation?
Yeah, so the bag, the biggest advantages with the bags is that they can be laid out and filled almost anywhere where you have a level surface, right? And for example, just last fall, driving through the countryside near Ames, I saw several of these bags out on the edge of fields, and they were there for a few months before they were being picked up, presumably on a farmer's field, away from an elevator. And so they're very convenient in that regard. They can be put out and then emptied pretty much anywhere. And so that's a big advantage. They are available and relatively inexpensive on a per bushel basis. So they're a cost-effective alternative or temporary solution versus fixed asset, cost that a grain structure, would have. And they also, they're not hermetically sealed, but they seal very well. And so once the grain is in there, there's a little bit of a carbon dioxide, atmosphere that establishes and essentially helps to preserve the grain. Provided also, however, that the grain is not too high of a moisture content. So that's one of the things that we have to be very careful about as we think about the technology.
Yeah, I think if you could just go into some of those particulars about actually putting the grain in there, and also the consider what you should consider when doing that. I think there's some specifics there that we need to touch on.
Yeah. So for example, if we talk about soybeans we typically harvest dry enough. They might be coming in at 10, 11, or 12% moisture content. And they can be put in the bags essentially at those moisture contents without really any concern as to being damaged over longer term storage period, especially if we're thinking about storing in the fall and into the winter time and early spring. They will store just fine in these types of bags. When it comes to corn, that's a little bit more of a challenge. Now, if we end up with a fall harvest where we end up with moisture content in corn, that would require drying, anything above 18, 19, 20%, or even aeration to shrink grain down, to a safe storage moisture content. That would be a limitation of where you can put the bags up. In other words, if I had damage to my grain storage bins, and perhaps to my dryer, but could get my dryer up and running before the harvest season, I have to run the corn through the dryer and bring the moisture content down to below 15% and cool that corn, because I cannot aerate in the bags, although they'll cool off as a function of the ambient temperature, before I put it in the bags. And so I would potentially, set the bags up near where my grain handling center is in order to access my grain drying system. On the other hand, if we end up with a fall, right now we have substantial drought conditions, and we end up with a relatively fast dry down in the field, and corn comes out of the field relatively dry, I potentially can put that corn directly into the bag and have the bag set up at the edge of the field if that's where I want to keep it. Or of course I can bring it to the farmstead where my bins were, and then fill the bins there without having to go through the dryer. So that's a definite limitation with regard to the maximum moisture content that should be allowed to be placed in the grain bags.
Okay, and then we have another slide, and I think that people who are thinking about deploying this technology are going to ask, what about the equipment? What do I need? And so we're going to flip to that, and then ask you to talk about what do they need and kind of the monitoring part of it.
Yeah. So one other aspect as we get into this and the equipment required goes, of course, into the sizes of the bags that are available. They do come in some different diameters, and from our perspective, we likely, because of the quantities of grain that we generate and the quantities of permanent storage that we may have lost, we would want to go with the largest types of bag sizes. So for example, they are available up to about a 500-foot length. And when we look at what the bagging can do as you fill those, you could put somewhere around 23 to 25,000 bushels or so estimated into one of those bags, which is actually a little bit higher than what is shown here in terms of tonnage there, but that is a function of the diameter length of bags that are available. And so 25,000 bushel units, when you think about replacing a 50 or 100,000 bushel bin that might have gotten damaged on a farm, that means 2 to 4 of these types of bags would cover that capacity, again, at the right temperatures, at the right moisture contents, and then of course temperature is something that we want to be aware of. Now, the type of equipment that's required, on the left-hand side, we see the loading or filling equipment, which basically rolls the bag out as it is being filled from a grain cart. Again, if soybeans are dry or corn is dry, that can be done very easily at the locations, and you basically move the equipment along till the bag is full. This type of equipment is not too expensive, really. I mean, you can get it somewhere around under $50,000 per unit from what I have seen. And it can also be rented or leased in terms of, or somebody can come by and do it for you. But of course, that again can impede your harvest, progress if you have to rely on somebody else coming to fill the bags for you. And the same thing then, once you have it loaded, you need a different piece of equipment to essentially roll up the bag, kind of slice it open, and take the grain out and transfer it back into a wagon. Again, the logistics and the equipment is available. It works very well. It's been developed, like I said, more than 20 years ago, and it's been successfully used. So in terms of the equipment, that is a cost. But again, it is a excellent alternative solution when we cannot rebuild permanent storage this close ahead of our harvest.
Mm. And then the last little piece is, when the grain is in the bags, what should farmers be doing in terms of monitoring?
Yeah, so monitoring is a little tricky because, of course, the bags can be damaged. I mean, they're not easily damaged because it's a good heavy-duty plastic. However, rodents and animals out in the field and so forth, can damage the bags. People climbing on it or clawing into it and whatnot can damage the bags. So there needs to be some protection or consideration in that regard. There are patches available that are, again, the technology has been developed, so these patches can be glued on to repair the bags. That's possible. There's monitoring equipment available. There's a CO2 monitoring equipment available that the Argentinians have developed that works very effectively. That not only draws a sample of gas from the bag or different spots on the bag, but also gives you an indication what the temperature of the grain is in the bag. And that can be utilized for monitoring. They've got GPS technology on there, so you can literally see and keep track of many, many bags at multiple different locations if you needed it. Again, the key part is, from our perspective, getting the grain, corn, soybeans, wheat or sorghum, whatever, into the bags at safe moisture contents. They will cool off as a function of the ambient temperature because, again, you're talking about something that might be 10 to 12 foot in diameter. There can be some condensation taking place, which is usually at the bottom of the silo bag during the cool down period in the fall and into the winter. That can cause some damage or spoilage to the grain, but in minimal amounts because, again, you create sort of an oxygen depleted atmosphere. And in the springtime, if you have the grain in the bags for too long, you can have the reverse kind of a condensation occurring on the underside of the bag, on the top side of the bag as a result of the solar radiation. And again, that's a relatively small amount, but we have to definitely be aware of that. And so the ideal range of storage period is probably from the fall through the winter into the early to mid-spring. And hopefully by then, some of the silos or bins would be back up and running and grain could be transferred out of those bags. But again, I've seen bags successfully stored into the late spring and early summertime without any major loss of quality.
Well, I think it's an option for people out there who've lost bins for sure, and we know that Argentina, has about 50% of its storage there, so it's a proven technology over a long period of time. So it's a very interesting technology. Is there anything else you want to add?
Yes, the only thing else I would add is that we have developed a list of contacts that we are aware of, that we've been provided, where people can obtain bags and the equipment. And the advice that we've received is obviously now is the time to begin reserving that equipment in those bags and put orders in order to have them available ahead of the harvest time, because obviously suppliers weren't planning that you'd have that much potential demand. So we would encourage you go to our website and look at that resource list as a guide that of available suppliers of equipment and bags.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Meyer, thank you.
My pleasure.